We have one person that is stuck in traffic, but they'll be here soon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alfredo Gonzalez, and I'm the coordinator for the Reproduction of Race and Racial Ideologies workshop. The panel that we have today complements the current spring quarter theme, which is Black Death and Violence, curated by Professor Kathy Cohen. So I invite all of you to come to the workshop, which is every other Thursday. The next workshop is this coming Thursday, April 23rd, and we'll have Donna Murch from Rutgers University. I want to thank a few people for getting the panel together. Professors Michael Dawson and Adam Green, Tracy Matthews, Dara Epperson, Julius Jones, Ainsley LeSure, and of course the panelists. We have a great panel of scholars here today, which was brought together by Professor Michael Dawson, the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Unfortunately, Professor Dawson could not be here today as he is currently attending to a personal matter. He does send his apologies to everyone in attendance and is sure that we will have a fruitful conversation today. All right, so let's begin. On August 9th, 2014, marked the day that Michael Brown, a young black man, was fatally shot by Darren Wilson, a white Ferguson, Missouri Police Department officer. Brown's death sparked weeks of unrest, which continued when a grand jury decided not to indict Wilson for the shooting. As a response to Brown's death and civil unrest in Ferguson, the U.S. Department of Justice conducted their own investigation into the Ferguson Police Department, which was released in March 2015. Some news outlets called the report damning, citing continuous mistreatment and discrimination against blacks in Ferguson. These events and many others like them, such as the Eric Gardner and Walter Scott cases, raises questions around race, police overreach, misconduct, and excessive use of force. Excessive use of force is one way of describing the type of policing conducted in the city of Chicago under former police chief John Burge, that systematically authorized and used electrical shock and mock executions to acquire confessions from mostly black suspects, resulting in their wrongful convictions. Our first presenter, Ming Francis, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. Francis received her doctorate in politics at Princeton University. Before joining the faculty at UW, Francis was on the faculty at Pepperdine University for 4 years. Francis' work sits at the intersection of American politics, race, constitutional law, and history. She is particularly interested in the construction of rights and citizenship, black political activism, and the politics of capitalism. She is the author of Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. This book argues that the NAACP played a pivotal role in the growth of federal court power in criminal procedure and subsequently in rights by helping the Supreme Court wrestle away jurisdiction from state courts in the first quarter of the 20th century. Francis is currently at work on a second book project that examines the role of the criminal justice system in the rebuilding of Southern political and economic power after a civil war. So, without any further ado,
This is the way that I go forward.
yeah, no, this one.
Which one?
This one too.
That one? All right, everybody. Hi, how are you today? Good. All right, so my name is Ming Francis. I am at the University of Washington. I want to start my talk today with two quotes. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of discussion about some of my thoughts and a little bit then kind of where I'm going to go from here. So the first quote is from Senator Benjamin Tillman, a Democrat from South Carolina in 1907. He says, and he's arguing this on the Senate floor, should the demon get the right to a fair trial and be punished in the regular course of justice. So far as I am concerned, he has put himself outside of the pale of law, human and divine. So this next quote I'm going to give is actually from Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson in 2014, his grand jury statement. It looked like a demon. All right. So the word demon, to refer to at some level kind of baby face, Michael Brown, stopped me in my tracks when I was reading this. A number of my friends on social media posted this quote online. And so the reason why it in part stopped me in my tracks is that I do historical work. I do work at the intersection, at least in political science, about race, American political development, which is a fancy word for political history, and the law. And the work that I am focused on kind of begins around the end of Reconstruction and carries forth until kind of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And it focuses specifically on the fight, at least the first book, on the fight to end lynching and mob violence across the country. And so the word demon, at least to me in my own research, is a bit too familiar. It's often interchanged with beast or brute to refer to the threat of blackness, and was often used for the torture or to justify the lynching of African Americans in the North and the South. It was clear from my perspective that racial discrimination in the framework of white supremacy and racism was present in Officer Wilson's decision to shoot Michael Brown. But everyone else did not see it this way, including the Department of Justice's report, which decided that no evidence existed to disprove Wilson's claim that he feared for his life.
Sure.
Many whites counter that this, and many whites have agreed with this, and counter that the stopping of Michael Brown and the decision to use deadly force were not racially motivated, pointing to the absence of racist statements from Officer Wilson and to the long-time elimination of explicitly racist laws in Ferguson and throughout the rest of the country. Polling results taken in the aftermath of Brown's killing revealed radically different interpretations of the events. More than 3/4, 76% of black respondents said that the shooting of Brown is part of a broader pattern, nearly double the number of whites who agree, which was 40%. This big racial divide raises, I think, critical questions about the legibility of racism when it is enacted upon black bodies. Put another way, the discrepancy in the seen or the unseen of racism and Brown's killing highlights a long-standing fissure in how individuals and political institutions in this country make sense of injustices where racism is alleged. So part of this, in trying to figure out kind of like why it was so apparent to me and so many others and why it wasn't so apparent to other people, right? It's not, I think these are all well-informed, very smart individuals, so why do some people see something that others do not? So I think part of this is, it has to do with something that I call kind of the legal fiction of the civil rights era. That when racist laws came down, hearts and minds would of course follow, right? Because we like kind of a nice, compact, happy narrative. So here we go. Oh no, let's try it again. I'm the most tech not good person. I have to get to my classes about 15 minutes early to set up. All right, so we love this story. Part of the reason why, I mean, Selma's great. We especially love the director, right? We love a number of the actors and actresses in this. But in part because it plays to the civil rights narrative, right? We see this in the media and in popular culture all the time, right? It's this narrative that says that we go from slavery to civil rights. And like everything is not necessarily like perfect, but it's pretty close to perfect, right? So there we go. Because this is what Hollywood funds, right? So we have 12 years of slavery, and then there's like a whole long period where like black folk are not in like popular culture and movies, right? And then we get this, and then we also get this. It plays, we buy tickets to this is what we love. But I mean, beyond being kind of up for obvious public consumption, I think it says something about the civil rights narrative that we want to believe in this country. This narrative at some level, this classical civil rights narrative, comes full stop at some level in 64 and in 65. The narrative tells us that there is a hard break between now and the past. This is problematic, I think, because it creates a blind spot to understand how the past influences the present, or how the present is path dependent on previous racializations of minority groups. There are also, I think, critical questions that Ferguson and the department and the report from the Department of Justice raised. So I'm going to throw out a number of questions that have been discussed by academics as well as people in the blogosphere. Is that what they call it these days? Okay. How to see, so important questions include how to see racism in the age of institutional colorblindness. Can there be racism without racists? Why is state violence enacted upon black bodies invisible to such large majorities of the American public? Are minority groups equally vulnerable in the face of state terror? And finally, who is responsible for the work of repairing democratic wrongs? All right. Okay. There we go. Right, like this is I don't think we both come right. Like, no. Okay. Right. All right. All right, so what I want to do with the remaining time that I have is to focus on two things and to try to make a case about one of them. So I think at the heart, and I think fascinating and horrifically at the heart of the Ferguson and the killing of Michael Brown is the question about how should racial discrimination be understood. I think even in a colorblind legal framework, it is still possible to see racism in Wilson's decision to shoot Michael Brown. I do believe there are tools, even again under the framework, that there are tools in our legal canon that help us make sense of some of the manifestations of contemporary racism. So what I'm going to do with the amount of time that I have is to reconsider the legal rationale the Supreme Court set forth in a 2006 workplace discrimination case called Ash v. Tyson Foods. And the rationale the court set forth in this case, and I'm going to describe it in more detail in a little bit, but that just because racism doesn't slap you in the face does not mean that it's not racism. And that's a quote from the court. In Ash v. Tyson Foods, at stake was the use of the word boy in a Tyson Foods plant. And so the question here was, boy on its own doesn't necessarily mean racism. It's not necessarily kind of a word in the way that we think the N-word or other types of words are like very racially charged words. But under certain contexts, the court wanted to the question before the court was, could this be kind of a sign of racial discrimination? Anyway, so I'm gonna try to walk us through that and how that might lead us to an understanding of that. The second thing that I want to focus on, and this is a bit of an area that Michael Dawson and I have worked on. We have a forthcoming article from Public Culture that focuses on neoliberalism and black politics. But looking at one of the things I think that the Department of Justice report does really well is to focus on the economic exploitation and subordination of African Americans in Ferguson, and showing how kind of this overlooked area very much intersects in critically important ways in the way that politics and law actually work. And so I think that is tremendously useful that came out of the Department of Justice report. All right. So I'm going to step away now and to focus on and to try to make a case that racism was explicit in Wilson's shooting of Michael Brown. And part of what I think this is going to turn on, and so I'm going to try to make an argument here that's going to link Wilson's use of the word demon in 2014 to this notion that the court used in 2006 around boy. But so first, let's take a look at some of the quotes from Officer Wilson's testimony. So addressing why so many shots were fired, Officer Wilson tells the grand jury about how he had to take down the monster of Michael Brown. He said that a shot hit Brown, but that, quote, he wasn't down. Instead, this is me now, instead, like an evil villain from a Marvel movie, he appeared stronger than before. Wilson fired, quote, at this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I was shooting at him. I don't even have the time to deconstruct that, right? End quote. And that face that he had was looking straight through me, like I wasn't even there. I wasn't even anything in his way, end quote. Wilson, in his description of Hulk at some level, right? Kind of a Hulk-like fit of rage, said that he was shooting Michael Brown in this way, and that Michael Brown, of course, was running through these bullets. He said that he made a grunting, aggravated noise. I've never seen anybody look like that. For lack of a better word, he looked crazy, end quote. When Officer Wilson fired the shot that would ultimately end Brown's life, he told the grand jury, quote, "I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. That's how big he felt and how small I felt." Wilson said the only way he could describe Brown's intense, aggressive face was that it looked like a demon and that he feared for his life. So I just want to stop here, in part because I was stopped when I read the grand jury testimony, for how much it reminded me, again, in so many ways, of my own historical research about the use of rationale and justification for the killing of African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. And to be very clear, and this is part of the reason why I love this what is in so many ways a childlike drawing here. Darren Wilson, many of you guys know, is 6'4" and 210 pounds. I mean, 6'4" and 210 pounds, and Michael Brown was 6'5", 290 pounds, right? So we have this kind of, Michael Brown, Darren Wilson, right? Demonic units, of course, right? And then you have Christian units, right? For God, country, and then, yes, because this is in so many, even though, right, there was an inch apart in terms of height, there was something about him that appeared so much bigger, right? Okay. Ah, man, I told you. Okay, bam, let's do this. All right, so what I want to do is to make an argument here. So I'm gonna do a few newspaper clippings, and then some comics. I use comics, cartoons. None of them are really funny though, to teach my students oftentimes about racial politics. And so these are actually headlines from the New York Times. And so one, right, so giant Negro disables 4 policemen in fight, right? Again, kind of this bigger than human sized person, armed Negro giant goes mad, right? Okay. I'm gonna hit this, sorry. All right, and there's a really long history around this. Jacqueline Goldsby, who used to be here, who's now at Yale, has written this amazing book, A Spectacular Secret, in which she in such meticulous research, documents the history of American lynching. And many of the phrases that she brings up that are historical use the word demon and brute and beast to refer to African Americans, right? So again, and of course, here's this notion of kind of what is actually justice. This is the lynching of an African American in 1927. This, of course, is something, again, continuing on. This is something that many people are familiar with. We have this. Oh, that one. All right, so this is actually, many people focus on this. I think it's at least useful in the context of this talk. So here we have this cartoon, many people argued incited the riot in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1896. There was great fear here of what was considered, right, Negro domination, Negro rule, and you have here kind of this black, really demonic creature with his talons. And this again is the fear of African Americans that has existed, at least in American history, for so very long. All right, so now what I'm going to do is to do a hard break. If we can think about demons and this here. I have 2 minutes, don't I? Okay. All right, I'm going to do this case and then I'm going to close. This was such good stuff. All right, so if we can step away from Ferguson for a minute here, there's this Supreme Court case that I want to talk about. So Ash v. Tyson Foods, I'm going to provide a little bit of background behind the case, the constitutional question, and then the decision. So Ash, an African American and an employee at Tyson Foods poultry plant, was passed over for a promotion and sued the company for employment discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A jury found for Ash and awarded damages, but the district court granted Tyson's motion for judgment as a matter of law and ordered a new trial. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the district court's order, finding that the evidence presented by Ash was insufficient to support the damages awarded. Tyson claimed that Ash had been passed over by a more qualified employee And in response, Ash introduced evidence of his own superior qualifications in order to show that Tyson Foods' reason was merely a pretext. The circuit court held that Ash's evidence did not meet the standard for establishing what we call as pretext. The disparity in qualifications needed to be, quote, so apparent as virtually to jump off the page and slap you in the face. In the course of its opinion, the 11th Circuit also held that the Tyson's plant manager's use of the word boy to refer to Ash repeatedly was not evidence of racial animus because it was never coupled with racial classifications. So Ash he had a white supervisor repeatedly referred to him as boy. At one point at some evening function, Ash's wife asked the plant manager not to refer to her husband as boy anymore. He laughed and said, well, he is a boy, right? So, but there was no kind of racial modifying term. So the question before the court here are kind of twofold. Did the 11th Circuit use the correct standard? And two, can an employer's use of the word boy to refer to an employee ever be evidence of racial animus? And so what I have on here is in so many ways, the courts, their argument that they're going to make here is one about just because the racism doesn't jump off the page and slap you in the face, doesn't necessarily mean it's not racism, that it's both helpful and imprecise. And this is where I think where it's the most helpful here on the second point. The court held that while the word boy is not always evidence of racism, it is not always benign either. The meaning depends on various factors, including context, inflection, tone of voice, local custom, and historical usage, and not on the presence of racial modifiers like black or white. So the 11th Circuit in the lower court opinion is going to argue that he said black boy, then perhaps maybe. But because he did not say black boy, that was not an example. So the Supreme Court is going to push back on that. So I think in closing here, I know I've used up my time, I think this at some level offers a way to try to understand the use of the word demon in Wilson's rationale and his at least account of the shooting of Brown here. If we think about kind of the word demon, there's a whole history behind that, right? Clearly demon for some of us, right, who go to church, demon, right, like that's clearly used in song and stuff. But there is also a very deep racial meaning. It's also the case that St. Louis, for those who are familiar with the East St. Louis riots of 1917, which is about 25-30 minutes away from Ferguson, there's a long history in terms of kind of context and location of racial violence here. So I think kind of contextualizing it in a much broader, sphere, that the racialized use of demon lays at least a starting point, rarely acknowledged, where legal doctrine in some ways helps to expose racism. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that great presentation.
And technical difficulty.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So our next presenter, Alice Kim, is a cultural organizer, activist, and writer. She is an organizer with the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, a project that aims to honor and seek justice for the survivors of Chicago police torture, their family members, and the African American communities affected by the torture. She also serves as the editor of the Praxis Center, an online resource center for scholars, activists, and artists hosted by the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College. She is on the advisory board of Regender and the editorial board of In These Times magazine. She is a former director of the Public Square, a program of the Illinois Humanities Council, and has worked with Ella's Daughter, a movement reimagining change, in the campaign to end the death penalty. And so now we have Ms. Alice.
Okay, thanks. So there's a video.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna pull that up. Okay, I'll show that later on.
Okay.
Okay. So the reverberations of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson were acutely felt here in Chicago, where we have been confronting our city's own brutal history of police violence. As Kathy Cohen and Danielle Allen noted in their important and recent op-ed on the new civil rights movement, That's not video.
Okay. I'm sorry. There we go. Sorry.
So as Kathy Cohen and Daniel Allen note in their important and recent op-ed on the new civil rights movement, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and now Walter Scott, these names mark iconic deaths, unnecessary, violent ends for Black men and boys in America. Cohen and Allen also point out that often missing from this list, but equally important, are Black women and girls. Renisha McBride, Ivana Jones, Zakiya Gunn, also killed by police or vigilantes. We know that they are not the only ones. When the Justice Department issued their reports following their investigations into Ferguson, I was not surprised that they could simultaneously conclude that there was a pattern and practice of civil rights violations in Ferguson, releasing staggering evidence to support this, and at the same time decline to bring criminal charges against Officer Darren Wilson for the shooting of Mike Brown. Their findings confirm what many of us already know about the police, that racism runs deep in the Ferguson Police Department and police departments around the country, so deep that police officers can get away with murder. It's important to note that the Justice Department's investigation only came about in response to the courageous protests by the people of Ferguson. As Michelle Alexander said in an interview with Democracy Now! After the report was issued, there is no way that the Justice Department would have investigated what was going on in Ferguson if the young people there hadn't stood up and taken to the streets. Without a doubt, it is precisely because the people of Ferguson rose up, stood up, and spoke out against the killing of Mike Brown. It is because they insisted that Black Lives Matter that an investigation even took place. So for me, what is more significant than the Justice Department's report is the power of protest that has been demonstrated in Ferguson and beyond. The power of protest to force local and national officials to pay attention to police violence, and the power of protest in seeking justice for those who have experienced police violence. Here in Chicago, we know far too well that police violence is not unique to Ferguson. The recent revelations about the Black Site off-book detention center in Homan Square, where Black and brown people have routinely been disappeared for hours on end and even days, tells us that. Not to mention the 306 people who were shot by Chicago police in the last 5 years, 89 of whom were killed, as documented by We Charge Genocide in their UN Shadow Report. Shootings by the CPD took the life of Rakia Boyd, a 22-year-old African-American woman who had aspirations of becoming a nurse, and Rashad McIntosh, who was killed just days before his 20th birthday on the back porch of a friend's home, and Pedro Rios Jr., a 14-year-old youth who was killed in Portage Park in my neighborhood not too far from my house on the 4th of July last year. So here in Chicago, we too have been witness to racist and violent practices by the police, and we too have been witness to the power of protest. For decades now, activists have been organizing against police torture carried out by the notorious former commander John Burge and his midnight crew of white detectives who brutally interrogated and tortured over 110 African-American men and women in their custody. The story of Burge and his torture practices is chilling. They used torture tactics ranging from electric shock and suffocation with a typewriter bag to mock executions. In Darrell Cannon's case, detectives attempted to hang him by his handcuffs. They played Russian roulette with a shotgun as they asked him questions, forcing the shotgun in his mouth and chipping his front teeth in the process. They then used an electric cattle prod to repeatedly electric shock him on his genitals. These were the kind of sadistic torture practices of Burge and his men. 11 of Burge's victims were subsequently sentenced to death, while most received long-term prison sentences or life without the possibility of parole. Today, some have been exonerated. Every release hard fought for tooth and nail. Others survived prison and served out their sentences, and yet others, approximately 20 men, remain incarcerated. For years, the media and city officials refused to acknowledge or investigate allegations of torture. It was only due to organized public pressure that the city conducted an investigation and later fired Burge in 1993. As Joey Mogul, one of the attorneys who has represented Burge survivors for years, has repeatedly explained, there is no question that the torture was criminal, violating state, federal, and international law. Yet, it would take the federal government nearly 2 decades to indict and prosecute Burge. As we know, police officers are almost never charged for killing, violating, or torturing Black people. Burge's prosecution was an exception to this rule. In 2010, 17 years after Burge was fired, he was found guilty of obstruction of justice and lying about the torture. Note, he was not prosecuted for torture because the statute of limitations had run out. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Many of us who have been involved in this struggle called for the prosecution of Burge. We felt that his conviction would be the only way to hold him accountable for the torture, that it would send a strong message that torture would not be tolerated. Yet, even after his conviction, justice remained elusive for Burge's victims, who continued to suffer from the trauma of the torture they endured. So over 1.5 years ago, the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials worked with Alderman Joe Moreno and Howard Brookins to introduce the reparations ordinance in City Council. It was a means of offering holistic redress to Burge torture survivors. Centering the needs and experiences of the survivors themselves, the ordinance called for financial restitution, a trauma center on the South Side that would offer counseling and job training for survivors of police violence, curriculum in Chicago public schools that teaches about Burge torture, free education in the city colleges, a public memorial, and an official apology by the city. Earlier this week, at a long-awaited hearing on the ordinance, the city took unprecedented and historic steps to provide an amended version of our reparations ordinance for Burge torture survivors. I'll be honest, the package is not perfect. We did not get everything we asked for. The $5.5 million in financial compensation is less than what we struggled for. I will also say this. As someone who has been involved in organizing around the cases since 1998, the trajectory of this struggle is not lost on me. When Anthony Holmes offered his testimony last Tuesday, he reminded us that when he was tortured by Burge in 1973, no one believed him. Because of a tortured confession, he served 34 years for a crime he did not commit. For Anthony and many other survivors who have no other legal recourse, the reparations being provided means that some of their needs will now be met. As Daryl testified on Tuesday, is it enough? Of course not. This isn't the world, it's just a small piece of the world, but we are in the world. The testimonies that the survivors offered at the hearing served as a reminder of what they have been up against all these years. The survivors have been the heart and soul of this movement, and their courage to keep speaking out about the torture is what has infused this fight for reparations. Once the reparations agreement is passed in City Council on May 6th, it's hard to believe that this history of torture will now be taught as a matter of course to 8th and 10th graders in Chicago public schools. I hope that kids learning about the torture in school will help them confront and end police violence in their own communities. I hope that the grandchildren of survivors will benefit from free tuition at our city colleges. I hope that we'll be able to build on a South Side facility that will offer counseling specifically to Burge survivors, that will be able to build on this, and it will become a space where all survivors of police violence can go for affirmation, healing, and support. And I hope that our public memorial will serve as a reminder to the powers that be and the people of Chicago that we can and will be free. None of this would be possible if it weren't for the decades-long struggle against the torture, and more recently the struggle centered on winning reparations. In fact, the ordinance had been stalled in the Finance Committee for over a year and a half. Even after we had garnered the support of 29 alderpeople, our requests for a public hearing were repeatedly ignored. Emboldened by the Black Lives Matter movement, the reparations campaign with CTJM, Amnesty International, Project NIA, and We Charge Genocide at the helm took on new life. We staged sing-ins and die-ins in the lobby of city council chambers, held press conferences announcing developments in the Burge saga, delivered over 35,000 signed signatures on a petition supporting the ordinance to Mayor Rahm Emanuel. We set up pop-up memorials and exhibitions in front of the mayor's office. In addition to these frequent visits to City Hall, we held marches, rallies, and teach-ins in multiple neighborhoods. We used the power of social media to build public support, and we tweeted thousands of messages to the mayor. We called, emailed, and lobbied our city council through good old-fashioned meetings, and we even took our message to the mayor's home one evening, spelling out reparations now in bright lights. So this video gives a glimpse into the organizing that has gone into winning reparations.
I believe in peace. I believe in a brighter future. I believe in myself. I believe in my parents. I believe in education. I believe in life.
We can make it, our needs are basic. Peace and hugs, will and love, blinking. More jobs, more education, less prison, less incarceration, more occupation, less standing around. Since I see this shit down. All my scholars, that's college down. I see your vision, young and profound. All my street gangs, it's time to turn back. Let's switch lanes, get on the right track. It's never too late to reach for the sky. All you need is courage and a will to fly. Gotta have faith when your back is the wall. We learn how to stand, leap up from the fall. I done seen it all, put the guns down, y'all. Write a new song, cause it's time to leave all. Like, we all have dreams, mutually inclusive but not those things. Living like matters, young kings and queens, more than a conqueror can handle all things. By any means, it's time to reach conflict resolutions in the streets. Just cause you and I don't agree, don't make me and you enemies. Get it, bless the child, what's their own, who love to speak, hold a microphone, committed to peace. Chicago, get my home, please put the guns down by the end of the song. Like,
Next, our next presenter is Randolph Stones. a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, where he directs the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Project, affording law and social work students the supervised opportunity to participate in policy reform and provide quality criminal defense representation to children and adults. He has previously served as the Public Defender of Cook County, the Deputy Director and Staff Attorney at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, and a partner in the Chicago firm of Stone & Clark, an attorney with the Criminal Defense Consortium of Cook County, and as a Regional Herbert Smith Community Lawyer Fellow for the Neighborhood Legal Service Program in Washington, D.C. Professor Stone is a past chair of the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section and serves on several boards and committees, including the Youth Advocacy Program Incorporated, the Federal Defender Program for the Northern District of Illinois, and the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. In addition to clinical legal education, his teaching and writing interests have included criminal law, juvenile justice, the legal profession, indigent defense, race and criminal justice, evidence, and trial advocacy. Professor Stone attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, received his BA from the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, and his JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School. Professor Stone.
Thank you. So the good thing about going last is half of what you were going to say is already. But my original plan was to try to connect Ferguson to other recent police killings and abuses and kind of review, from Rodney King to the LA Rebellion in '92, the riots in Cincinnati and Miami over police killings of unarmed men. I was going to talk a bit about the Chicago police torture cases, which is unnecessary now. Maybe talk a bit about Attica and the prison rebellion there. Jump to the 60s and talk briefly about how the black returning veterans from Vietnam hooked up with the Black Panther Party over issues of police brutality and misconduct. Talk a bit about the assassination of Fred Hampton and other Black Panther Party members in the late 60s and 70s. And then kind of dive into the civil rights movement and law enforcement's violent responses. Back up to the Rosewood Massacre, the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Go to Jim Crow and examine the lynching phenomenon. Convict leasing, the black codes, Reconstruction, retrenchment. Talk about the slave patrols, who many people argue are the historical precedent for modern policing. And then talk a bit about the brutal and violent institution of slavery and end perhaps with the thousands of lives lost in the Middle Passage. I quickly realized I couldn't do that in 15 minutes. The whole point was the idea to try to connect what happened to Michael Brown and Ferguson to the sort of a chronic, historic, systemic disregard and disrespect for the rights of people in marginalized communities in general, and black life in particular. And the theme is Ferguson is everywhere. I've given talks about Ferguson several times over the past few months, and every time I have to update the talk with a new victim. Walter Scott in South Carolina, who you've all, I'm sure, heard about. Eric Harris in Tulsa, Oklahoma, shot in the back by a 73-year-old part-time policeman. Laquan McDonald, who many of you may not have heard of, the 17-year-old right here in Chicago, who was shot 16 times in October of 2014. Rekia Boyd was mentioned. We've all heard about Eric Garner in New York. John Crawford, who was killed in a Walmart for walking around the store with a toy gun that he had picked up in the store. 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed by police. 7-year-old Ayanna Jones, young girl, shot to death in Detroit by SWAT team police who raided the wrong apartment. And we could go on and on about some of these incidents, and the point is to try to make a connection. My students and I, We try to talk about individual cases, but it's important to connect the cases to a larger issue. And so for me, these police killings, torture, misconduct create sparks of anger and desperation. But the kindling includes the absence of jobs, the ridiculous unemployment rate for young black men, the absence of decent wages, the denial of access to educational opportunity, resegregation of public education, and most importantly, the mass incarceration with all its collateral consequences. I got three very brief charts. The first shows you the trends in incarceration in state and federal prisons. And as you can see, from 1925 to 1980 or so, it's relatively constant, somewhere around 200,000 people in prisons in the United States. And then in the 80s and 90s, you see this huge exponential increase until now we're up to somewhere about 1.6 million in prisons, then another 600,000 or so in jails. So up to over 2.2 million. We are number one in the world in terms of incarceration. We have, I think, about 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And this is all the result of policy. This is not reflective of any huge increases in crime, right? This is change in policy. A lot of it started or completed under Bill Clinton when he passed the omnibus crime bill that expanded the mandatory minimums and began increasing sentences across the country for and resulting in this huge incarceration complex. The next slide just gives you a graphic of the rate of incarceration per 100,000 in the U.S. And it's quite dramatic. You can see white, black, and Latino. The dramatic disparity in terms of who's being incarcerated in the United States. And the final slide just shows you the chart in numbers. And it looks at the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, meaning that for blacks it's about 1 in 3, for Hispanics about 1 in 6, and whites about 1 in 17. This is the likelihood that a black male will be incarcerated in this country in his lifetime. And it's, every time I see it, it's dramatic to me. And I'm used to it. You know, I go to the jails and prisons in this county and in the state, and it's still shocking to me. Every time I walk in the back of a courtroom in the lockup and I see nothing but black faces. It's quite shocking. But anyway, let me talk just a bit about the reports. So, as you probably know, there were 2 DOJ reports that were issued on March 4th, 2015. How many of you have actually seen or read the reports? Okay, good. So they're available online. You can pick them up anytime. Download them, and they're worth a read, I think. The first report was on the shooting of Mike Brown. So it's an 86-page report, and it catalogs the law, the physical and forensic evidence, and the witness accounts regarding Mike Brown's killing. And the report concludes that given all the evidence, the federal government could not prove that Wilson's use of deadly force was unreasonable and that he acted willfully. That's what the report concluded. It did not talk about whether, and there's opinion of whether he could be prosecuted for state charges. It just narrowly focused on whether or not he could be prosecuted successfully under the federal statute. And it concluded that, based on their opinion, was that he could. The second report is a 102-page report, and it's on the Ferguson Police Department. And it reveals the department as routinely violating the Fourth Amendment, stopping people without reasonable suspicion, arresting people without probable cause, using unreasonable and excessive force, in their contact with the citizens of that city. Found extensive evidence of discriminatory treatment and a pattern and practice of racial bias. You know, you may have seen the little news articles about the racist emails among the supervisory personnel in the Ferguson Police Department, and how the focus of the department was on generating revenue for the city. So essentially, they were financing city government on the backs of poor black people in Ferguson. The racist emails, you know, were just a distraction, right? Because I'm sure if you examine the emails of any corporation or institution, or many corporations and institutions in this country, you will find racist emails. Witness the Sony hacking just a few months ago, where you found racist emails among Sony executives. So that's not surprising. But what's most telling is racism in action, right? How it can and does affect people's daily lives. So I want to talk a bit about that and this, and maybe talk a bit about some solutions that have been advanced and that we've been thinking about over the past few months. You know, I sit on the board of a group called Youth Advocacy Programs, and one of the things that they do is provide wraparound services for vulnerable kids. And they take any kid, you know, kids with criminal justice issues, kids with mental health issues, and they provide wraparound services. And in talking to one of the youth workers said to me, he says, well, you know, one of the things our kids tell me, when I said, why, you know, what about this gun, these guns? Why are the kids so fascinated with guns? And he said, well, you know, the kids say to me, when they're carrying a gun, they think about, do I want to get caught with it, or do I want to get caught without it? And that's pretty a sad commentary for a 14, 13, 15-year-old to have to weigh the calculation in their neighborhood and in their community. Is it better for me to be caught with this gun, or is it better for me to be caught without it, in terms of my health and my safety and my likelihood of continuing on? And they're afraid of their community because it's so violent. They're also afraid of the police because of the way they're treated. So possible solutions. We talk about structural systemic change and or procedural reforms. And some are overlapping, and there's a tension, right, between procedural reforms and changing the fundamental function of police and the criminal justice system, including prisons and jails, in maintaining the status quo. So one question is, should police use force when confronting someone for selling cigarettes or jaywalking? Should someone be arrested for selling cigarettes or jaywalking? Do you view the police as crime-fighting warriors, or do you view them as being responsible for community caretaking functions? Who needs to carry or needs lethal weapons? Do all police at all time need to carry a lethal weapon, regardless of training and experience? These are some more fundamental questions that maybe we need to think about. Integrating police departments. So in Ferguson, you have this phenomenon where the community is 75% black, but there are only three black police officers out of the 50 uniformed police officers. And most of us understand that we need to integrate our police departments. Today, in most urban police departments, the patrol units are relatively diverse. But it gets less and less diverse as you work your way up the chain of command. And it's not that that black police officers or black police chiefs or black mayors or black attorney generals or black presidents will solve all our problems, right? And Hakeem Al-Budi in his book talks about how some black police officers feel they have to be more brutal and use more force to get along with their white colleagues. So it's not just about changing the color, although that's important. We also have to change the institution and the culture of the institution and question the role and purpose of police, jails, and prisons in this society. Body cameras, another solution that's being advanced, and on par, I think most of the researchers tend to agree that it probably will be a good thing, but it's not a panacea, obviously, right? We've got video of Eric Garner being choked to death, no prosecution. So video is not going to solve our problems, and it can create other problems in terms of surveillance in the community. So we need to think a little clearly about that before we jump on that bandwagon. It brings back the question of being over-policed and underprotected in many of our communities. Training, clearly that's something that most of us think may have some impact in terms of community policing and getting police into the community and working with the community on creating public safety, cultural competency, obviously, treating people with dignity and respect. We have to, unfortunately, we have to train people on how to do that. I had a pedagogical moment just a couple weeks ago in court. I'm in court with one of my students, young African-American woman, third-year law student. We approached the bench waiting for our client to come out of the lockup. And the judge looks down at me and says, counsel, you shouldn't bring your client shouldn't be sitting in the courtroom. She assumed that the young black woman with me, who was appropriately dressed, was a client, was an inmate, was the defendant. Now, is that racism? Is that implicit bias? Or is it ignorance? Or is it all three? All in the above. So, training. Obviously, she needed some training. We're talking about disciplining bad cops, and how do we do that? My colleague at the clinic talks about that there's a certain small percentage of police who are responsible for a large percentage of civilian complaints. But there's also, and they act with impunity because they know they'll never get punished. Their colleagues who turn a blind eye and don't report them. There's this stop snitching code in the police department where the police are afraid to report other police. So that's an issue that we need to look at. And I've got a lot of things that I think may be helpful. Transparent data collection, right? We have no data on how many police shootings occur in this country. No accurate data. We've got piecemeal data. And so we don't know, are there just a few bad apples or is the whole barrel corrupt? I don't think we know the answer to that question because we don't have the data. So we need that. Finally, I just want to say a bit about reentry and collateral consequences. In this country, about 700,000 people a year come out of prison every year. Every year, about 700,000 people come out of prison. In Illinois, it's about 40,000. Of those 40,000, about 20,000 come back to Chicago every year. They go to 4 or 5 neighborhoods that are already under-resourced. It's legal to discriminate against felons, right? You can deny them housing, you can deny them jobs, access to training, and there's a disenfranchisement problem across the country. There's 6 million people who are denied the right to vote because they have a felony conviction in the United States of America.
Wow.
1 out of every 13 African Americans are denied the right to vote because of their status as a status of conviction. I'm going to wrap up by just saying this. I think we need to connect this struggle in criminal justice and for equality and fair treatment under the criminal justice system to the human rights movement locally, nationally, and internationally. And I know some of us have been doing work in that area, but we need to continue to expand, to connect, and to collaborate with others who are fighting for fairness, justice, and equality if we're going to have any success in changing our criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Stone. And so now we have serving as a discussant, my very good friend and colleague, Ainsley LeSure, is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. She was the inaugural recipient of the jointly sponsored dissertation fellowship for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality in 2012, for the year of 2012-2013. She specializes in the subfields of political theory and American politics. Her research concerns the structural oppression and domination, democratic theory, and political resistance. Her dissertation is entitled Making Racism Visible, Achieving Racial Justice Through Political Resistance. In this project, she approaches the theory of racism through the lens of resistance and concludes that we should shift from thinking about our contemporary racial problems as an obviously unconscious and inadvertent result of a hard-to-see new racism to an active political project of making racism visible by recuperating the institutional account of racism through the work of Frantz Fanon and Hannah Arendt as models of a democratic practice of hermeneutical interpretation. To move towards racial justice, Ainsley argues that we would do well to reproduce this practice in our everyday lives and our political institutions.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try to keep my comments short so we can get to the discussion. And unfortunately, I didn't prepare anything because I was going to recap what was said, but you guys were really quite clear. And so I just want to add a few things to the discussion. So an important piece of this entire thing for me is the reoccurrence of the word racism and racist. And it seems as if that's such an obvious thing going on to us. And that's the thing that we keep saying. It's so easy to see for so many of us. But what's striking and what my research is about is that in the academy, in mainstream conversation, racism is a dirty word, right? Racism is seen as a divisive concept. It is one that is oftentimes cast as conversation closing, not very useful for sort of framing the kinds of problems that we are talking about. In its place, we see things said like racial injustice, or we point to implicit racial bias, right? Cognitive dissonance. And we sort of make this radical break, or if you maintain the racism concept, you make this radical break between old racism of yesteryear, which was overt and in your face, and new racism, which is more implicit, very hard to see, not quite as clearly thematized. And what becomes clear to me is that, no, people see it, right? There's so many of us who see racism, right? It's oftentimes a matter of getting people to act upon and acknowledge what they see and to take responsibility for what is seen, right? So something that really stood out to me was Professor Stone's comment that the Ferguson police officers were routinely violating the Fourth Amendment, right? It is documented, okay? But nobody is held accountable for it, right? That means that the police are routinely violating the law, right? And it's allowed to go on. How do we understand a problem like that? That's a political problem. That's a political institutional problem. We are living in a state of exception. That means that the political and governmental institutions that we say are the markers of civilization, that are supposed to secure our civil societies and our interactions with one another, keep us safe and maintain interactions amongst each other, isn't working in this case, right? How are we to understand this? So recently I taught democracy in America for the core in the political in the University of Chicago, College Core, and Tocqueville talks about the tyranny of the majority. And there's a footnote there, and I wish I had prepared and I would have brought up, but he talks about, so he's sort of bringing up this point, right, that the sovereignty of the people in American democracy is sort of ruled and determined by the majority, right? We vote, we have sort of this running track record of what the majority of the people want, and then that's the means by which our governmental institutions are run and our sort of societies are run. But he said that this majority has sort of unbridled power in American democracy. And it's really quite scary and threatening. And he says there's this threat of tyranny. And there's a footnote where he talks about, he gives examples of this tyranny of the majority. So there was one time, there's two examples. One is the press. So the press runs a story that people in the town didn't like. So they take them up and imprison them to actually protect them from the majority of the people in the town. But the majority of the people in the town break the prison, take them out, and basically kill one person and severely beats another. And nothing at all happens to the majority, and they're just hurt. The other example are black people in the North. And Tocqueville is like, you guys restrict black people from voting. And the colonist is like, oh, no, we don't. don't accuse us of that. They can vote. The laws allow them to vote. And he was like, but I don't see any black people voting, so whatever. He's like, oh, well, they're too afraid to because they know that if they showed up, then they'd, be hurt or whatever, right? And so there's this way in which race in this country acts as an instrument for tyranny, right? It always has. And the means by which it does so is through a state of exception, right? And the interesting part about everything everybody did here is that they're sort of connecting history, which has these clear instances of racism, right? And I ask you, how do those instances of racism become clear, right? It's not so obvious that calling somebody boy is racist back in the day. Or, wait a minute, there was no concept of racism, right? Racism is a very new concept. Barnard Hesse does that work to sort of to date the concept of racism. That didn't exist until after the Holocaust. We were talking about racial prejudice, okay? So there's not even a concept to even thematize racism, okay? So how is it that how can we talk about something being so obvious before and a little blurry now? No, we make things obvious. We make them visible, right? And we have to make people take responsibility for them, right? And one of the ways that you do this, you have to make, sort of these connections between historical junctures. If it's so obvious here, then it really ought to be obvious here. And we have to continue to make that case over and over again. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation and to just thank everybody for their comments and open the floor up for conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we open the floor to the audience, the panel will respond to what Ainsley had to say. I'm fine.
Yeah, I think that was great. Yeah.
Any questions for the panel?
So I guess I want to engage, everyone, but specifically this idea, Dr. Francis, you brought up about the term human and the term boy, and kind of understanding how these are to some folks explicitly racial terms and to others not. And so I was pulling Ming on this too, this question, and Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Tyrone Foreman in their iconic article, I'm Not a Racist, but brought up this idea of colorblind racism. And their kind of end note was, we have to call out racism for what it is. If it's implicit, we have to shine a light on it. And somehow that's a solution. But I guess my question is, as someone who lives in the blogosphere, who spends a lot of time calling out racism and is trolled and threatened, and I haven't seen a tangible difference in the racism that I experience from calling it out and making it plain. And so I guess I kind of wonder, like, how much of an impact is there to this kind of issue of fighting against white supremacy and anti-black animus, and the kind of ugliness of the term racism, and we all shiver and we run away from it. How much work do we really do in quelling it by making it visible? I guess I kind of feel like at this point, maybe I'm a little disillusioned, but that I'm not so sure it necessarily has to be unearthed specifically and explicitly in order for us to do the same work in combating it. So I guess if you could speak to that point.
I'll try to keep this very short. I think, so one of the things that I do want to address is the exhaustion that happens, right? I think that there's at some level, kind of a civic sacrifice that is placed on the shoulders of Black people, especially in these examples, and then oftentimes minorities and white allies in terms of wanting to explain to you guys, right, wanting to explain racism. That is a form of not only exhaustion, but also terror itself, right? And continuing, like, and me as a professor, did you see the latest video? Right. I just can't, right? So I completely understand that though, but I do think that there's something to be said. I mean, whether it's political scientists, sociologists, or people in the public, not always is it helpful in terms of like, this is actually what is going on and making that plain to people who, let's say, just can't see it. But oftentimes it is. I mean, in political science, the standout example is going to be Bush's Lee Atwater's use of the race card, right? With the Willie Horton app. And naming that and calling it out. People are like, yeah. I mean, again, it's this idea that Black men are dangerous, right? He went out on this weekend pass and then raped and killed. But once it was actually called out, people were like, oh. And it did make a difference. I mean, Bush was still elected, right? So, but it did in terms of people's understanding of that, and then in terms of future campaign media appeals. It did. But I do understand at the individual level how it can be exhausting. I don't think that it is the work of everybody to make plain racism to everybody.
I mean, I didn't think that it says something about the nature of our public sphere. I think that it is really quite, democracy doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Or the material, so like a lot of the work, my work is about talking about the worldly resources we need to even resist, to even make legible and visible a claim against whatever is happening, right? And like what typically happens is that conversation about race is completely shut down. So to even bring it up is to be making a radical move. But because it's so shut down, like what happens when you bring it up is so surface level. Because it's not like what you're like, this whole rhetoric about racism going underground, I think is actually kind of pernicious. Because it's like, underground to who? To what? Like, when you start to speculate about what's going on in people's minds, you are making it invisible. Because now I'm giving you the power to tell me, no, that's not what I'm thinking, that's not my intention, and leaving it at that. Well, let's talk about what is done, what is legible here, whether you ought to be able to do that or not. Like, think about it. Everybody made sure they paid their taxes. Well, just about everybody, right? Made sure they paid their taxes on April 15th. Why did you do that? Well, it wasn't, man, I wish Americans would pay more taxes. Because, I mean, don't you see? We need roads, and we need this in our governments, and I just don't understand why Americans don't see why they need to pay taxes. No, you pay taxes because if you don't, the IRS is going to come find you. You're going to end up in jail. There's, like, repercussions for doing that. And there's a way in which we don't make people responsible for their racial practices, what they say with regards to race, how they act in regards to people with race. Like, to make a claim that somebody who's unarmed was a demon to you, and that they were so scary that you had to pump them full of bullets. The fact that that's a credible claim speaks to the horrible situation we're in. It's scary, right? Like, that's not just Darren Wilson. That's a jury. That's a judge. Like, that's a lot of people involved in this, right? And so that's why I think you have to make racism visible, right? But when it doesn't take, I think that just shows how it is not just about you. It's about the context in which you're trying to operate and act within. And the context we're in right now is pretty dilapidated. It's pretty horrible. And that's the scary part. That you can act and say something and it kind of doesn't mean much. And that's what we've got to, that's the work to produce the worldly resources to the act of making visible actually takes and makes a difference, right?
Comment?
Got a question over here.
Okay. Let me just see if I can do this. Well, one thing that's real clear is that what's happening now doesn't just start now. It started way back before slavery began. The mind that went into Africa and took the Africans out and brought them over in ships and da-da-da-da-da. And so that sort of mindset is still undermining everything that's going on here. It's like it's mutated into this monstrous kind of thing. But the monster that's projected onto the black man is really the monster that's on the inside of the folks who are projecting it. That's a concept in psychology you might want to look at. It's how we project onto others our own internal guilt, shame, envy, whatever it is that we're feeling about something. So I see that as a projection. And that's hard to get at because it's a psychological kind of thing. But it's real nonetheless because it acts out onto people. The second piece is that what's real clear to me, and I think to many others, is that those men who shot those black men and continue to kill them are heroes among what we might call the races. And so when you see a man who kills a black man as a hero, if the jury sees that, and they have that same mindset, they're not going to convict him and they never will. And that's why they can get away with murder, because they're seeing us doing a favor. They're keeping alive a cultural concept and belief that black life does not matter, or that black men are a threat to the white system or the white values or the white whatever. And so as long as they continue to kill black men as the way they do, they will continue to be held up in high esteem by a certain level of mindset in the white community. And that's just the way it is. And I don't know how you get to that, but it's real that those men who killed black men were considered heroes among many of their own.
Well, let me respond to part of that by saying that it doesn't have to be that way and that we can do something about that, right? Because if you look at, to me anyway, and maybe I'm just an optimist, but the person who killed Eric Harris is being prosecuted, right? The guy, and the person who killed Walter Scott is being prosecuted.
Those are exceptions, but yes.
They are, well, but, so the question is, why are they being prosecuted? I would argue that they're being prosecuted precisely because what happened in Ferguson. Because people got out in the street and protested and demanded and raised hell and made a shift in the way people are now looking at this.
Some people are now looking.
Yeah, I would argue that but for those protests in Ferguson and around the country, those people would not be prosecuted today. So, I think we can make a difference, is all I'm saying.
I think you're right.
Okay.
The question.
Yes. Mine is kind of simple. One for Alice. Given that the city paid $20 million in legal fees to defend Burge, how come that amount couldn't have been given to the victim of torture? Second thing, to Professor Stone and to you, you brought up a very good point in the Justice Report about the breaking of the law, the Fourth Amendment, and so forth. Could some of the problem go back to Judge Keeney's decision where he said that we were never considered ever to be citizens. And so even though that decision hasn't been overruled, yes, we have the Reconstruction Amendments, but for the most part in history, they haven't been enforced either. So it comes down to the fact we have in Ferguson taxation via citation. So should the question of what citizenship really means be discussed, since when the amendments were passed, there was never any discussion, or at least among the victims, of what this new citizenship really, really entails, vis-a-vis the larger context of what citizenship means. You know, because someone can come from another country and over a certain period of time get citizenship here, but then they're not, they won't be operating under the false pretenses of citizenship which African and other immigrants color find themselves. So should the question of citizenship vis-a-vis the Judge Taney decision be something that we should be discussing to really force a conversation that's never been had?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, I find it, I've been to Ferguson, and I find it ironic that Dred Scott is reportedly buried not too far from Ferguson.
Right.
But I think, you know, as a legal matter, there's no question that we have all the legal rights and of citizenship in this country as a legal matter.
Right.
The problem, of course, is getting those rights enforced and recognized and being respected by the majority or the dominant group. And that's something I think that we have to continue to fight for and struggle for to make happen. That's our, I think, you know, this racial fatigue thing, I go through it a lot, obviously. You know, I was, when she mentioned it, I thought about the incident that I mentioned in court. And as I'm standing in front of this judge, you know, I'm thinking, do I need to reach up and just slap her? Just call her out? You know, but I'm thinking, well, I have a client here that I need to represent, that this judge is going to make some rulings about. And then I'm thinking about my student. You know, I need to protect her, and I need to make sure that she is processing this in the right way. And so my focus was on my client and my student to make sure that they stay healthy through this process. But it's a burden that we carry, and sometimes it's more difficult to carry than others.
In response to the question about the money, you know, I think that the amount of money that the city was willing and that they have spent on defending Burge, and then the amount that they were willing to offer as financial reparations, I mean, I think that that speaks to what the city's priorities are, and that is something that I think is problematic. I mean, 5.5 million is too little. There's no doubt, right? There's no doubt that that is not enough money. And that really no amount of money, and the survivors have said this over and over, no amount of money can actually, you know, make up for what they had to endure. At the same time, the reality for the survivors was that many of them don't have any other legal recourse. Those that do can actually pursue that. They can choose not to take part in the financial reparation package, and they can pursue a lawsuit. But for those who have no other legal recourse, this is it, you know? And so I think in listening to the survivors, you know, they wanted to take this because if they can get close to getting $100,000, that will make a difference in their lives. Many of them are now older, which is why we also fought for, you know, initially it was City College for the survivors themselves and their immediate family members. And as we came to talk to the survivors, we realized that many of them themselves won't be able to take advantage of free City College. You know, Daryl Cannon is over 60 years old, right? He's not going to go to City College at this stage in his life, but his grandchildren can, right? But back to the financial compensation, I think that, that amount is what was on offer, and the survivors felt like they wanted, it could make a difference in their lives. And that's another sad reality, right? That's the sad fact of the matter, that they would be willing to take that when, it feels too little. But I think that when Randolph was talking about needing to connect this to human rights, right? Mm-hmm. Needing to connect this to jobs and the lack of jobs in our communities and all of those things, that is really important for movements for justice to actually take up those things as well. Oh, I also wanted to say one other thing about making racism visible and it not being enough, because I think it's really only the beginning, right? In the context of the Burge cases, making the torture visible, having the torture survivors' experiences heard and known, that has only been one part of the struggle. And even doing that was a challenge in and of itself, right? There was so much resistance to believing that this could possibly happen. And the city for too long was willing to cover all of it up. So it's not enough, actually, I don't think, just to make racism visible, but then you actually have to fight for actual justice, racial justice, and then that's often a fight. I mean, in terms of those who celebrate white officers killing black men, that was also the case with John Burge when, it was exposed, and when people were fighting for Burge to be removed from the police force, his brothers on the police force actually threw parties for him and fundraised for him and made T-shirts, defending Burge. So I think it's a struggle and it's a fight, and it's only because of that fight that we've gotten as far as we have. And yet, sometimes, yes, it does seem too little, but I think that also in terms of just the reality of that this will make this offers a modicum of redress for them, and hopefully, I think, Mayor, I always call him Mayor Daley, Mayor Emanuel, he says that he wants this reparations package to bring closure on this. Like, he's had enough of this. Let's just get this over with, almost, right? That's, I think, the sensibility. For me, reparations package doesn't bring closure, right? It's a beginning of a healing process, not an end. It's the beginning of a healing process. It's the beginning of the city taking responsibility for the harm that is done, and it's not an end. And also, the Burge survivors aren't, torture doesn't begin and end with Burge in this city either, right? So we know that this package that is specifically for, Burge survivors, that there are so many others who need to be lifted up in the same way, to be acknowledged in the same way. So it's just the beginning of that fight, and hopefully this measure will offer something in that sense, that we can look to other forms of justice, because, prosecution of Burge, it seems so clear. It happened so late in the game that he wasn't even prosecuted for the torture. But even as such, it was, if we don't do something for the survivors themselves, then we're left with, we're left with what Burge has done. We're left with that harm, and this can begin to address that, I think.
Yeah, the person in the back.
I don't know, did you mention Ricky Boyd? Did you all?
Okay.
Well, I just came from that trial, and I have racial fatigue. At this point, it is not people be Servant, it's people be Antonio Cross. And I'm really, I put a lot into this, and a lot of the advocates out there put a lot into getting this here. And I do want to say that we had Dante Servan charged before Ferguson. Okay, so Dante was already going down that path before Mike was even shot and killed. But with that being said, I don't know what's going on here. It seems as if they just charged him to go through the motions, and they dismissed the case against Antonio just to try it with Servan. I was in court all day today, And every single minute, it was Antonio Cross, Antonio Cross. He pointed his cell phone. You were scared. The officer was scared. And this is the prosecution as well as the defense. And at the very end, you hear Ricky Boy. For hours, we're sitting in there, and for 5 good minutes, you hear Rakia Boy.
Where stage is the case at this point?
Well, they actually did a direct verdict. They're saying that because and I'll talk to you about it more. They're saying that because, a direct verdict means, it means that the defense or the prosecution gets up before the case is even over and says, we got enough evidence that this case should be over. So the defense got up and said, look, all the witnesses are contradicting themselves, as if each witness doesn't have a different story. That's what you're supposed to do. You know, I mean, the guys have testified that they were smoking and had a little smoke, had a little drink, and then they're walking down the street, and the next thing you know, they're being shot at by a police officer. Everybody's running in 5 different directions, and then when they come back to the scene, one of the people that they with is dead. Practically, she was still alive at that moment, but shot in her head. So you would expect that everybody would have different points of views, but they're saying they're contradicting each other. It's like, no, that's what trauma will do to you. It will make you see different things.
Yes.
They also said that, Antonio pointed his cell phone.
So
Thank you. I'm like, okay, so, black men can't have
projection is
cell
just going
phones.
on.
Don't have a cell phone, don't have a wallet, don't have anything in your hand when some man pulls out of an alley that you don't even know who he is, and he starts shooting you with an unregistered Glock. Okay, so I don't know. You get them to this point and you just feel like you're being sold out while you're sitting watching the state prosecute, and and there's nothing you can do. They're talking about they're gonna throw me out. You see how I'm using my hands. Every time they would say something stupid, I go, object. They're gonna throw me out, instead of all of the folks talking crazy. They even called Antonio an offender. They have the detective on the stand testifying to what happened, and it's people be serving. And he says, okay, so when the offender, he says, oh yeah, Antonio. At one point, the prosecution brought up the assistant state's attorney, which is their witness, and they said, they got up themselves and said, we're gonna recross the witness. I said, it's a direct, it's your witness.
Let me say this just briefly. I mean, one of the reforms that people are suggesting in this area is that when you have a police officer accused or charged or suspected of misconduct, brutality, killing, you should have a special prosecutor who prosecutes the case as opposed to the normal prosecuting authority. And the reason is because the normal prosecuting authority works with the police, and the police help make their cases. So people are saying that what you need is an independent prosecutor whenever you have a police officer charged. So that's maybe some of what you're seeing there, the need to have an independent prosecutor as opposed to the normal state's attorney who works with the Chicago police all the time to try to prosecute those cases. Hopefully we'll get a better result than what you seem to be expecting.
Well, unfortunately, we have gone over time, 15 minutes. We do have a light reception and beverages afterwards, so we could stay and mingle with our guests. But would you please join me in thanking our panelists?
Yeah.